Welcome, everyone. So this week I want to start us off by highlighting what I think of as the salient features of the American political system and talk a little bit about how I think its basic structures are relevant for understanding how it is that policy gets made, or why it doesn't get made, or why it sometimes gets made so poorly. We'll do a little bit of myth busting over the course of the semester, and here's one. The purpose of the U.S. Constitution was not to create a system of democratic control or of majority rule. Instead, it was designed to limit democratic participation, to control the majority, and to inhibit majority rule. You can get a sense of the logic of that if you read James Madison, Federalist number 10 and Federalist number 51, which you can easily find online. The U.S. Constitution was intended to make change difficult so that government was resistant to the passions and desires of the public at large. This was the lesson the framers took from Shays' Rebellion and other post-revolution uprisings of the people, while also, at the same time, limiting centralized power that could enable government oppression. And these are the lessons learned from their recent experience with King George III and the revolution itself. Now, part of why they wanted to hamper majorities is because they thought in a world in which the majority ruled, the minority would always be insecure, always in danger. That's a real fear. But keep in mind that the majority they were most worried about at the time were white, property-holding, and disproportionately slave-holding men. That is, themselves. It was a system intentionally designed to frustrate the ability of even determined majorities to exert their will. Now, these are the three basic features of the system, which I am hoping will look pretty familiar. Separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. Let's start with separation of powers as a refresher. Right, the three separate branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, each have their own particular responsibilities. The legislative branch makes the laws, the executive branch implements the laws, and the judiciary interprets the laws. You can see that again here. Again, this is to keep too much power from being concentrated in one place, an intentional design to inhibit policy making, to make action difficult. Checks and balances is related but different. Separation of powers give different branches their own powers, while checks and balances requires them to cooperate with each other to get anything done. It's a system of separated institutions sharing powers, as presidential historian Richard Neustadt put it. But once again, notice the effect, to make it even harder to effect change. But it's even more complicated than this, because power isn't just divided by functions, but by levels of government too. Some powers are reserved to the national government, as you see here. Some powers are reserved to the state governments. And yet other powers must be shared by both the federal government and the state government together. These are so-called concurrent powers. This feature gives us even more complexity and more forced cooperation. And that cooperation is not always easy to achieve. Just as the executive and legislative branches have different interests and want to preserve their powers, likewise, the state and federal governments may have different priorities, different preferences, and different interests. And there are lots of governments in the United States, more than 90,000, maybe on the order of some 520,000 separate elected officials. If we think about the 2020 presidential election, there were 10,500 separate institutions involved in carrying out that election. It's a really complicated system. Now, this complexity we may think of as normal, right? Because it's, the water we swim in. But it's really unusual when we look at other democratic systems around the world. And maybe this gives us some early hints about why the U.S. has weaker social policies than other rich democracies. So this chart shows us what are called veto points in political systems. And that's basically how many places there are in the policymaking system to stop something from happening. because of the very structure of our policymaking system, it's harder to get anything done in the US, or easier to stop something from getting done than it is in other democracies. So when you hear people complaining about gridlock, it's a feature, not a bug. And of course, even more complicated than that, because I've only been talking about the formal institutions of government created in the Constitution, but we've also got political parties and interest groups and private corporations and nonprofit corporations, think tanks and policy planning organizations and media and public opinion, and you get the idea. So, when we're talking about policies, what are we talking about? Right? We're talking about laws. We're talking about rules and regulations. These are often done in the executive branches or at the agency level. We're talking about court decisions, and that's, again, federal, state, county, or city at the municipal level. We're talking about budget decisions, often occurring within agencies, but also as part of the lawmaking process. We're talking about tax policy, And we're also talking about cultures and habits, right? Things that we do just because that's how we do them. Right? Again, notice how many moving parts there are. This is now looking at the Code of Regulations, the total number of pages published, right? Just to give you a sense as to just how much is going on, right? So this is the CFR, the Code of Regulations, is the codification of the general and the permanent rules that are put out by the departments and agencies of the federal government, right? This is now looking at total pages published in the Federal Register, which is the daily journal of the federal government in which all of its activities, newly proposed rules, final rules, executive orders, other agency notices, right, that accumulates all that together, right? Again, you get the idea, right? There's so much. And as you'll know if you're paying even a little bit of attention, layered on top of all of this is the fact that we live in a deeply partisan era. This is what political scientists refer to not just as polarization, but as asymmetric polarization. Meaning, as you can see here, that the Republican Party has moved much farther to the right than the Democratic Party has moved to the left. So the takeaway. Right, the US system is exceedingly and unusually complicated. It's hard to affect change, and even when it happens, it tends to happen slowly and incrementally over long periods of time. There are exceptions, which we'll talk about, but that's the general rule. And I think that's important to recognize and to accept so that you don't go out into the world with unrealistic expectations of how much change can happen and how fast. Progress is often slow and hard fought.